Yeah, we'll try to keep this roundtable somewhat short, and then so we can get to audience questions soon. Three great films, thanks. And I wanted to start because it seems to me that one theme that's running through is a kind of haunting, a kind of abandonment. Adam, you use that surround sound, ambient kind of layering of that sound through and through. It's so much present. And it seemed to me like, what were you evoking in terms of what kind of haunting is radioactivity? I did want to keep on with the theme so that maybe all of you could speak someone to this kind of haunting abandonment. This Irandikara is not on the map. The girl is no longer there. People are hallucinating. And thus, in your case, like, it seems people are there in places which should have been abandoned, and you're curious why it's not the case. Talk a bit about how you're depicting these stylistically across your films. So Adam, maybe you can begin.
Sure. I think one of the differences, I think our films share a lot in common. One of the differences dealing with Through My Island is it's sort of, a very known subject, right? I mean, it happened a long time ago. There's been lots of films to deal with it. And the thing that I felt was missing was this sort of intangible thing that you get just from being there. And I think the sound was a way that I really connected with that. And the way that you can stand in a neighborhood in Royalton and see the flashing lights of the reactors and hear the sound of the turbine. To me, that just sort of connected me in a visceral way to the sort of place and to the way the reactor is part of that community without actually interfacing. And I think because it's largely ignored by the local people, it seemed a way of capturing that sort of presence, but also sort of the oppression of it by their lives, or just sort of the fact that their lives don't really include a lot of acknowledgement of its existence there.
Yeah, whereas in Koodankulam it is quite different that they don't want that reactor there, but they can't get rid of it also. And the images were also like, from the future, probably if anything happens, that image of a girl, that is like classic kind of images you have associated with different kinds of disasters. So it was trying to imagine that situation, which is, and also nuclear hallucinations, also in terms of what the nuclear experts thinks, that also is very hallucinatory. They think that a disaster can never happen. The Indian nuclear reactors are like so foolproof. And they have a Fukushima-resistant technology. I mean, there's all sorts of these things, expertise which is produced on a daily basis, which is also, for me, that was also very hallucinatory.
For me, it was, for me, one of the main difficulties making this film was how do you show something that is invisible? That's the main question that goes through the work, I think. In I just avoided to do any kind of there's no archival footage, and I'm not using any typical representation for nuclear energy in the entire film, I think. But it was something that I could feel very strongly, because you get sensitized to situations. I was in situations where I got very afraid myself, because I felt that the radiation levels were extremely high, and then I measured and I was right. So you develop like this sense for places that are really bad for you, and that's also especially in the case of the horse breeders, that's a farm where nobody should live, because the radiation levels are like around 3.0 microsievert, and that's the normal, and that's really high. That's really high. So the normal radiation is 0.01 microsievert. So if you have a situation where you have like 3.0 as normal, that's really bad for you. So that's something I was asking myself the whole time, how do you convey this feeling, and also how to, I made this film staying in a shrine that is in Minamisoma, sleeping on like the floor in a small room, and often it rains a lot in Japan, especially in this area, and rain means something else there. You know, rain means that the radiation levels will be very high the next day. So it's not the romantic being in a shrine, whatever, you know, kind of thing. So that was one challenge that I found very important that I went through making this film.
Yes, I don't know where to start. There's a lot that can be said, but in all of your stories, there's a question of what do you plan to say, or what do you decide to say explicitly versus to say symbolically, like you did with sound in your film. And so I want to start with you and ask, how did you choose those people as subject matters, and what stories did you plan to tell with them? I have to say, when I was watching this, I was quite struck by all of them, but particularly by the TEPCO engineer, because the whole idea of fishing in that area just outside the Fukushima plant that continues to leak tons and tons of radioactive water all the time, and then to actually eat one, and in particular a flounder, which is the fish that you are supposed to avoid because it's the bottom feeder and therefore picks up all the radiation. That's what was he trying to prove there?
I don't know. You know, I'm not making films with a clear message. I don't have a message with this film. I observe situations that have become meaningful to me to some degree, but it's also related to more universal questions that I think are in the film. The question what home means, and how we deal with the theme of home in modern times, because Furusato, as you know better than I do, has a much deeper meaning than just home, but it means it describes the first landscape you see as a child, and the last one you will see before you die. That's your Furusato. And that was something I found while I was making this film, and the film became very much about that theme for me. You know, why do people not leave a place? That was my question, but there is no simple answer to that question.
Yeah.
And regarding the characters in the film, they have all very different stories. So the activist was the person who brought me to Minamisoma in the first place. I read an article about him. So I met him, and then I started, you know, finding out more about this place, and I thought, wow, that's crazy. And maybe I should just, instead of having this potpourri all over the exclusion zone, I should be as concrete as possible and just place it there. And then I started the Kazuki, the punk rocker. I met him in the first couple of weeks while I was just standing on the street, and it was winter, it was bitter cold, and there was no one in this ghost town, and suddenly there were like 3 young gentlemen walking down the street with masks and guitars on their backs. And I was like, what are they doing? And then we asked them, and they said, oh yeah, we have a punk band, and we are going to rehearse now. So I filmed the rehearsal, and you know, from then on, you know, you develop like these relationships, and they lead somewhere, or you know, the TEPCO engineer was maybe the most complicated character, also because you could see, it's difficult to see only clips of a film, so the film has a certain style.
Yeah.
The scenes with Kenji are very dictated by him, because he's permanently aware of the camera. And there was like this was his idea, by the way. This was his idea to eat the fish, to go out there on a boat. I had just the idea, you know, I want to have the image from the perspective of the wave. That was my idea as a filmmaker. And then he was like, oh yeah, we can arrange that, but maybe we should go on a fisher boat. And I eat some fish. And I said, great, let's do it. So, and there was like the PR, the head of, public relations from TEPCO, from Tokyo, was with on the boat. It was very, very complicated with this guy. And I believe it's the only representative of a higher rank of TEPCO that ever appeared in a film before. They are not allowed to talk. And it was really difficult to, he saw the film just recently, and he was like, after I won like the Golden Dwarf in Leipzig, and it was all over the internet, he was like, oh, you won this, congratulations, you won this great prize. Let me see the film. And then he was like, he said, oh yeah, it's so coded that I won't show it to my friends, but there's nothing dangerous for his position, I think. He doesn't see his position in danger. He still works for TEPCO. He builds new nuclear power plants in Turkey now. So, they're very different. The access to these, they were very.
Yes, but they all sort of speak to this idea of the furusato, the mythical home.
Yeah, he was surprised that I was asking him in this situation. He wanted me to ask him about, aren't you afraid that this fish is highly radioactive? That would have been a typical journalistic question. Yeah. But I didn't ask this question, but I asked him, what does home mean to you? And he was like, and you saw the answer. So that's like, yeah.
Yes, and the juxtaposition with the bags was very nice. I like that.
Adam, so on that point, and Fathima too, like the actors in your documentaries, you used a lot of, Adam, archival footage, archival testimonies as well, in terms of voiceovers at times. And Fathima, tell us a bit about just this really interesting thing that you call tamasha, if you can elaborate on that, this idea of performance and how these protesters are performing in many kinds of roles of very different set of stakeholders. So how do you go about doing that?
This was also part of my practice-based PhD. So the idea for me was like this: there is this violent narrative. So you can like say you can believe, you can disbelieve whatever they are saying, but the moment you go out in the street and protest against it, then you have to face the consequences. So in India, there is this thing called tamasha. You say like, if there is a fight happening, people will sit and watch what's happening. They call it, they're looking at it as a tamasha. And when the elections are happening, then people will say, oh, it's a tamasha. It means the moment anyone says anything is a tamasha, it loses its legitimacy. So my idea was that, can you look at this nuclear expertise as a tamasha? Because for anyone who is looking at it. And the way this was done was like, I used to set up these tables and put this globe and all these things there, and said there was this invitation. Anyone who wants to be a nuclear expert can come in and be an expert. And different people, someone wanted to be like a scientist, someone wanted to be a politician. So they all take up those roles. And then whatever else happens, that I film in a very documentary way. So nothing is scripted, so whatever is happening is the exchanges. Sometimes, as you see with this older woman, attacking this guy, because very often they never get to meet the real officials on ground. And very often this is like an opportunity for them to vent what they have to say.
Something about how you went about going about with the archive, because you have the most archive, less say social actors giving you testimonies. But
Yeah, I don't know how to connect that directly to, what you had was so alive and fun. I was dealing with something in a different way, and I guess I found myself doing a lot of listening. This was a very sonically focused project, and just a lot of listening to these very informal and kind of casual oral histories that people did. One of the things that happened in the aftermath of Through My Island here in the local area was a lot of sort of very loosely organized sort of citizen groups tried to do things. And one of the things they did was take oral histories and sort of study the world around them in the way they could best. And I found that to be one of the more compelling things that I found in the archives. Some of the stills that you see are photos of trees that people thought might be losing their leaves due to radiation. And you sort of see some images of animals that might be sick. And so I think for me, it was that kind of mentality, that sort of trying to put myself in the situation of someone with not a lot of technical expertise, hearing a narrative, you know, from lots of sources that everything was fine, but then trying to feel out where their life connected to that and how they fit into that. And I think I just found that a really hard to grasp but fascinating kind of thing. And that's what led me deeper into the archives. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, what I found to be very interesting about watching all your films is that the rhetoric that happens in nuclear power is so similar everywhere. And in particular, watching your film on India and watching those actors act out what the experts are saying, you know, they're saying exactly what they say in Japan, which I find to be kind of ironic and quite sad. But the other thing that that brings me to is a lot of anti-nuclear documentaries, or some anti-nuclear documentaries in Japan have gotten repressed. And you know, there have been consequences for some of the documentarians that have made them. So I was wondering if any of you have felt or experienced any sort of pushback for making this documentary?
You never know what happens behind the scenes, right? So my film was not shown. It is shown worldwide in big film festivals, but it was not shown in Japan yet.
Okay.
So that's, but there is also like only one interesting venue. That's the Yamagata Film Festival, and they didn't want to show it. But maybe they had also enough of Fukushima-related films. I don't know. But that's something I can say. I didn't feel. I felt the opposite, basically, that people were really, you know, when we won this big prize, I didn't expect this to happen, not at all. But the jury was so, you know, they were so clear about the importance of this film. So yeah, that's always a journey you can't control, that a film really makes.
Yeah, but you didn't get any pushback from France, maybe?
It was not shown there yet.
Yeah.
In my case, when I was making the film, I was in the Koodankulam area near where the scientists live. So there was this policeman who came, deleted the material, everything. And they were asking me and my friend, both of us were women. So they were asking, are there any men with you? You know, and we said no. So then I'm like, okay, these are not very important people, you know. They don't know what they're doing, you know. So that was a way of getting away from that. And I think in India there is a lot of censorship regulations. You know, you need a censorship certificate to show. And the thing is, the people in the film, they were very clear that don't put it on YouTube, because the police sits and watches who is giving these interviews, you know, and then they face consequences. So they want to be there, but they don't want it to be freely available online so that the Koodankulam police can watch it. And like one of the biggest connoisseurs of anti-nuclear films is actually the police department. So that's this thing. So in India, it's like a thin, fine journey. You know, you show it to small groups. You know, you do, and I think even showing it is also a bit of a, like, you also look at these encounters as a tamasha, you play act, you know, like, you try to push as much as you can.
I don't have a lot to say about that. I mean, filming it through my island was very non-remarkable to the people there. I think it's just so saturated with media coverage for, you know, whatever it is, 40 years almost, that it wasn't dramatic in that way.
Yeah, and also it's a very different kind of environment because it's quite a ways in the past now. And
yeah, and actually, I mean, there have been more things written recently about the fact that the plant is so open, because I think it's fairly common for people to actually sneak onto the grounds and go across the river and go around in there because it's not really secured at all. I didn't take advantage of that because it didn't seem relevant to what I was doing and not a great idea in general, but it you know, it sort of seems almost more accessible than you might imagine, which I find very interesting, that it's become a like not secure space. It's kind of, you know, worth thinking about.
So I want to quickly ask something and then move to audience questions right away. And since one of the challenges you said was like making invisible radiation visible in some sense, maybe invisible fear or very visible fear also visible in a certain kind of way. But it seems, and because this is all three documentary filmmakers, I wanted to ask you what you're doing with documentary, with this particular subject, in very particular styles like sensory ethnography, performative documentary, observational documentary in that sense. But tell us a little bit about how you see yourselves as documentarians working on this kind of project, particular styles. And
So I don't see myself only as a documentarist. My work is very broad. I'm working on a fiction feature right now. So it always gets very, I like to confuse the line between what we consider as documentary and fiction. And I think, there are a lot of terms like, sensory ethnography. I don't know what that means really. I think there's a lot of inspiration also coming from certain films that had been made in Harvard, in my work also, but it's, I wouldn't put the label on it. I think these are only labels to sell something.
For me, it was like working against the truth production potentials of documentary, and being a practice-based project, there was also like a lot of pro-nuclear Indian documentaries produced by the state, where these people like, sit and say, like the scientists say, how it is all like, quite fine, there is nothing to fear, etc., etc. So for me, it was about like questioning this, just because you put in a camera and someone says, how do you believe that? So for me, it was about pushing the testimonial potentials of documentary, and actually playing with the idea of documentary. That was what prompts me.
Sure. For me, I think from film to film, I approach things differently. But in this case, I found myself collecting all this different sorts of material, and lots of it was very different from what we saw, and just trying to look for ways of moving historically, and from archival still photographs and archival video, and sort of this senses of studying the landscape. And I don't know if I have any clear way of articulating that, but I just found myself trying to find resonances between the different materials that I had, and trying to find that sort of hidden, invisible thing in those different formats, and then
right, and so it's pretty complex, interviewing many different categories, as Thorsten was saying. Maybe we should move on to audience questions. I'll certainly have one mic with Jennifer, and but I can go to the.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure. Okay, I just wanted to thank you all for like showing all your films and stuff. It was really cool seeing, I guess, attitudes towards like nuclear plants just from like different areas of the world. I had a particular question for Nuclear Hallucinations. So in your film, you basically you like offered up people to like do like satirical like impersonations and stuff. Was your focus more on what the people said, or what the audience around, like how they reacted? And then what do you think like satire reveals compared to like just directly asking a question?
Okay, for me, like, it was, for me, those interventions were as much important as the edited film.
Yeah.
So I was looking at film as more of a process. And for me, this was like about creating certain interventions at certain places. So whatever happened around the film, it was more of a theater probably than film. So that had its own value at that point of time. The more interesting things I found, more filmic, they make it to the film.
Okay, I gotcha. Thank you so much.
Hi, I just want to thank you all for kind of coming and sharing your films with us. When it came to just like the difference, I want to ask a little bit about Japan versus India. And then in the India film, we saw like a lot of the defiance and kind of like thoughts against the nuclear programs shown through kind of very direct means of like kind of real aggressive outbursts by the locals, or by kind of really loud music festival type things where they would like sing out the lyrics to anti-nuclear like sentiment. Whereas in Japan, like films focused more on like just the daily lives, or the kind of how it's changed or how it hasn't changed. But do you feel like some of the facts that it hasn't changed, like the fact that people are continuing on with their lives or insisting that they hold a festival in a nuclear zone, is that like a, would you interpret it as a form of defiance or protest on its own, or?
That's very difficult to say. Don't get me wrong or let me sound arrogant or something, but it's very difficult to judge about the overall of the film without seeing it. So these clips are like, these are like, they stand out somehow, maybe. They're louder than other passages. There's a lot more to it. But I thought that the Samurai Festival, the Sumanama Oi, was very telling about the way that has to do with Japanese culture also, to say our tradition is 1,000 years old and we are going to get over this too. That's what I felt very strongly. Nuclear energy won't destroy us, and the situation here won't destroy us. And there's something beautiful about that, but there's also something like incredible. I saw, there was also something incredible sad, because I just filmed like, horses. That's something you haven't seen, but there are like this 900-kilogram horses who were dying from radiation poisoning. Exactly these horses, and they couldn't use these horses in the festival, and they imported them from somewhere else in Japan. They were not using their own horses anymore. So there's something very, it's something, it's not clear what I think about that. But it was very powerful as a statement also. Suddenly to see all these people there. Yeah.
Kind of like a collective of people, like you defying their like own safety with the basis of like tradition and culture.
I mean, the radiation is something that you can ignore very easily because it doesn't smell, you don't see it, it's not there. And the situation is really strange because it's, the radiation appears in throughout the nuclear exclusion zone. It's not everywhere the same because it's spread out. And they had the black dust that the activists put together there in the first scene. That's something that was caused. So TEPCO scraped down the nuclear elements that they burn in the reactor, in the core of the reactor. They scraped them off to make them live longer. And what they produced was like tons of this black, highly radioactive dust. And they didn't know where to put it, so they stored it in the facility. And they had like 3 complete meltdowns and explosions in the reactor. So the whole shit was going up in the air, and the wind was carrying it through overall the landscape. And that didn't have to do only with with the core meltdown. That was the cause of something else. And you find this this black dust get everywhere. And then after rain, after a strong rain, it gets collected in puddles, and then it dries out, and then people step into it, and you breathe it in. And that's the highest danger that you have in the nuclear exclusion zone. It's not the radiation that you are exposed to over your skin. It's more the inhaling of nuclear particles. And that's insane. That's really insane. It's just everywhere. And you can walk down the street, there's nothing, and then you measure on a particular point, and it's.
And
I think the situation that Trempop is describing in Minami Soma is going to be different from what Fathima is describing, because Fathima is basically describing a protest situation, whereas Trempop is basically describing a victim situation where the victims are actually just trying to get on with life and overcome it. But generally speaking, in much of that area in Fukushima, it's very difficult to talk about the accident or radiation or anything that would actually be opposing nuclear power, because there's almost a sense of shame there, where a lot of people in Fukushima actually supported nuclear power. They were quite dependent on it in some of those little communities until the accident happened, and so they. Yeah, because they were quite dependent on it. That whole area in Fukushima had what, 10 nuclear reactors?
Oh, wow.
In one tiny town. It was insane. So
could it be like a small form of like denial in a way?
yeah, I think there's a certain kind of denial. There was a big game of denial in terms of radiation.
The only chance is if you decide to stay there. The only chance is the denial, to say this is not going to hurt me, because otherwise you go bananas. It's just it's just a situation. That's what I understood, and that's why I felt often so strange, because I was wearing a mask, and I was often like behind the camera and was like, damn, they need to wear a mask. I'm only here for 2 months or 3 months, but they're here the whole time. But wearing these masks and everything, it's a confession that the danger is there and the danger is real. And that's something I try to show in the film, like this uncertainty. Nobody knows, but it's there. Nobody knows how bad it is, but it's there. And that's I think that's the actual problem. It's a psychological one.
About India, I think from the film you think that it's all defense, but these people are seen as some kind of lunatics. The people who are protesting, they are seen as actually anti-nationals. People who are like, you have cases of sedition against them. So in the film, I film, but there is a lot more of it, all of which have put in the satirical register. Because if you open the news, they'll say like, we have got the latest things, we can build both the bomb as well as have, electricity. So all this rhetoric, in the film I'm kind of pushing it to the satirical register, but that is the more prevalent thing in India. You do think that it's a very good thing, like, and nothing much can happen to any of the reactors. That's a more prominent view, and these people are seen as like fringe elements who should be jailed, shot at, So that's not the larger, this thing is in some way corresponding to what is in Japan as well.
Questions? I just had a brief question for Fathima. In the short bit that you spoke to preface your film, you mentioned something that I would like you to explain further that I think appears in the poetics of the film, but this is about like the people in the town who imagined like a future without them, and this like struck me in the film in the scene where you see just the vague, like opaque outlines of human figures on the beach, on the shoreline. I was wondering if you could like say more about this idea of imagining a place without them, like thinking about their futurity without them.
Thanks. Actually, when I went there, they used to tell me about this. There is one Tamil film, this is in Tamil Nadu, the language they speak is Tamil. There is one Tamil fiction film in which a village disappears, and there are no documents about the village, and there is nothing, no trace that that village ever existed, and that's a cover-up. A village has disappeared and everything about it has disappeared. So they used to tell me, have you watched that film? This is going to happen to us. The thing is also because it could be because of an accident, but it is also because of the amount of state violence associated with the whole protests. So for them it's not just the radiation itself, but it's also the associated apparatuses of violence. So for me, that in the film, it was about to bring, and also there is a lot of allegations against this one particular plant. One, it is on a tsunami-affected coast. Secondly, there is a lot of questions about the kind of spare parts which are being given to this plant. The company which is providing the valves, employees were arrested in Russia, and China, which is taking the same from the same company, they had asked for checks, but India said fine, there is nothing, they didn't ask for any checks, and one minister said when there is such a big reactor, a couple of valves can malfunction, that's fine. So it's also a question of of course they are against nuclear power per se, but also the question of it being on a tsunami affected coast, as well as the substandard materials which they think is being used for the reactor. So for me, it is like a very, very possible future. It's also about the time. When will it happen?
Okay, so I just have a question. So you lived with these people who suffered from the nuclear malfunction or something. So what do you think? Like, what should governments do in the future to prevent stuff like this? Like either building a new plant or someone who suffered from the old plant.
I think if you're asking about nuclear energy, like personally, I would feel that one should move towards renewable sources of energy, and it's not even economically viable. And in a place like India, it's not always about electricity, it's also about the bomb. Like the energy and the bomb projects are very, very linked. So we have had experts coming on TV and telling us, yes, we can do away without the electricity from this, but we still need the bomb. So it's a part of a larger bomb power project. And personally, I would say that the thing is to move towards renewable energy and get rid of nuclear energy, but I don't see that future happening anytime soon.
For me, it was a question when if you make a film like this over a couple of years, you keep thinking, and different questions are arising. And for me, it became suddenly so clear that always in a situation of an emergency, like a catastrophe, we try to fix it. We try to clean it up. Let's clean it up. It's absurd to clean it up, but they're still trying. And I was wondering why we never ask the bigger questions. The bigger question would be to say, we just can't afford to waste so much energy. It's always a question: what is the substitute for the nuclear energy if we don't have it anymore? Just to use less energy. That's what I would say. And it's absurd to have a country like Japan that is earthquake stricken, and they have like more than 1,000 earthquakes a year over the magnitude of 5, more than I think 1,200, and they have 54 nuclear power plants that are all built next to the ocean. So that's like kind of, if that's not absurd, I don't know what is absurd.
Adam, your film it's almost elegiac in its feel. It sort of starts with an image of death, and it feels like we really are meditating on something that, not that it's cleaned up and decommissioned, but that's over. It's like it's this problem from the past. Thorsten, with your film, it's like you're on a kind of a cusp with nuclear power, where it's an ongoing thing, but it's reached a point of kind of complex crisis that is sort of existential, and so there's much sort of ambivalence, it seems, in your film, of the people and sort of the kind of relationship between expertise and the community, and then Fathima, for you, it's like gung ho, in India's future is the nuclear future, and it can only be satirized and resisted with whatever means are possible. But I don't know if that makes sense, but it feels like this sort of geographical and cultural difference is also a kind of, it's about some kind of uneven development in the world.
I think it's also the larger geopolitical situation also. Like, in Europe is not going to have any more reactors, like except in like UK is trying to, I'm sure, most probably it may not work out. And whereas all these technology, there is a certain kind of nuclear renaissance which is happening in the so-called third world. So, and like, that way, I think that also explains the different trajectories in all the three films. And interestingly, in even places like Bangladesh, who are now interested in nuclear energy, the interest is not necessarily coming from energy. It's always the idea of the bomb always is very much part of the project, and US of course is catalyzing everything, the India had the Indo-US nuclear deal, which allowed, because India was not part of CTBT, so we were not sold any of the raw materials, but after the Indo-American nuclear deal, it has become possible for everyone to sell it to India. So I think it's being, but the strange thing with a thing like nuclear energy is like whichever part of the world it is, it's going to come and haunt the whole world. It's not going to stay in one place.
That's a tough one to respond to, other than that I think you bring up an interesting point about the sort of different temporalities that all the films are dealing with. I don't have anything really to add, other than I will say that my film was a conscious sort of more attempt to sort of have a subjective response to the Fukushima events. I began working on it around that time, and it was more about what was close at hand, what was sort of part of my life that could connect to that, because I wasn't in a position to make a film that directly addressed it, or I didn't feel that I was. And I wanted to sort of feel like, where in my life can I touch that? And I happen to have been born, just a few months after the 3 Mile Island event, just a few miles from there. So I had a sort of connection that I wanted to sort of, explore, and that's sort of a way that I was triggered to visit the historical events.
Yes, and just to continue on this idea of techno-modernism, it's very interesting to see that the rhetoric in India is exactly the same as the rhetoric in Japan was in the 1970s, which was that we need nuclear energy to become fully developed and we'll be number one. And oh yes, there is this idea of the bomb that Nakasone actually wanted, but is never really talked about. And now that Japan is very unlikely to be building new nuclear reactors in light of Fukushima, the concentration now is for Japanese companies to sell their nuclear power to places like Turkey, where your TEPCO engineer ended up, and to India.
And England.
England
England builds 3 new nuclear reactors. So it's in the middle of Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, and France has, I think, 80% of the electricity comes from nuclear power plants in France. So it's not over in Europe, not at all.
Yeah, the biggest Indian nuclear reactor they're setting up in Jaitapur was initially through Areva, the French big energy company. So we have a question from here, and maybe one last from there.
Thank you for the great documentaries. I have a question for Chunpop. Throughout the filming progress, how aware were the people outside of Fukushima regarding the people staying in the exclusion zone? And like, just throughout the process, like, how aware do you think the government was with the everything that's happening? And what do you think were their stances regarding those people who stayed?
I'm afraid I didn't understand the first question. Could you?
Just like, how aware were the people outside of Fukushima regarding the people who still stayed in the exclusion zone?
Well, that's very difficult to say. I don't want to guess. I don't like to guess about those things. I can only speak from personal experiences. And I filmed quite a bit in Tokyo also, things that didn't end up being in the film. I was interested about the way that the energy produced in Fukushima, and the way the energy produced in these reactors went to 100% to Tokyo. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to show that, but it seemed not to be a good idea finally. And the one situation I experienced, which I still remember, was in Kyoto, where I went to a sake bar. That I like sake a lot, so I went to one of these beautiful bars, and I was with a Japanese friend, And the guy behind the counter, he owned the place, and he would offer us sake from Fukushima. And it was in 2012, and I was asking him when the rise was seeded, and he said it's from 2011. And I said that I didn't want to drink that, and he got really mad, actually. And that's very unusual to experience that. And he said, we have to share it. Okay. That's just one example.
Okay.
And the second question?
What was the government's reaction or like stances on the people who still stayed after radiation?
I mean, the government never forced people with police or other forces to leave, which surprised me also. But no, that's not the way it works also in Japan. I mean, the resistance that the horse breeders show is incredible. They are the only farmers left in this entire area. It's crazy. Everybody else left.
Yeah.
So, and it's ignorance from the side of the government. That's what I felt very much. Because they didn't. There's still 140,000 people living in temporary housing. And the suicide rate in this area is, especially around Minamisoma, went up to 70%. They kill themselves because there is no future. They can't go back to their homes, and they sit like in these metal containers. Yeah, it's pretty sad though.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you all for showing your films and the work you've done on especially like the aftermath of these disasters and the activism behind them, because like you said, the media usually focuses on the one big event and you don't really hear much about the follow-up. But one question for Trim Pop was, one of the most striking moments I thought in the clips was when the activist was confronting the officials at the race, and obviously the officials knew there was radiation, and the activist was saying that the radiation was even higher. And I was just wondering, when the activist was going around and providing masks to the children, I was just struck, like, if these parents were kind of engaged in like a willful ignorance of the effects of radiation, or do you think they were more educated about the consequences and for whatever reasons were just accepting those consequences?
This situation was bizarre, and it happened as you see it. That Banjo was giving out his masks, and there was giggling, basically. That was the reaction, yeah, this strange guy, because he's a very unusual, for Japanese people, especially in the countryside, he's very unusual, and they understand also that he's not from there. So there are other forces playing into this, but I think one of the biggest crimes that the Japanese government committed is really not to educate people who live in these areas what radiation is, how you measure it, and how you protect yourself against it. It's really, there's a scene in the film that I filmed on the horse farm, and I asked Miwa, the horse breeder, if they have a Geiger counter, and she said, "Oh yeah, I find it for you." So she started searching around in the apartment, and she found it somewhere. It was without batteries. She put it in batteries, so they never use it. And then she brought it to the table, and then they started measuring, and they measured 2.5 microsievert inside the house. And they said, "Oh wow, that's high." And then she tried to measure herself by putting the Geiger counter on her skin. And then somebody said, "Oh, no, you can't measure the inner radiation like this," but she didn't know. People just don't know what radiation is and how to deal with it.
We will have to end the conundrum of radiation there. We really overstayed our time here. Thanks, Noriko. Thanks, Adam, Fathima, Thorsten. Thanks to the wonderful audience who stayed till the very end. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful fall break.